Recording is on. Right, so I'm Tom. I'm a film student, and today I'm going to be talking to you about aesthetics and style in Edgar Wright's films and why they're so fucking great. Now, he's one of my favourite directors, and I'm going to talk about the aesthetics of his films, primarily those of Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. But to understand aesthetics, you must first have to have a basic understanding of the key elements of film form. Cinematography, which is the art of the camera, and mainly follows shot types, camera movements, camera angles, and lighting. Then there's editing, which covers transitions, visual effects, and such. Mise en scene, which translates to from the French to sort of like that which is on screen, which compromises the location, the setting, the set design, costumes, hair and makeup, and props. Then there is sound, which encompasses the score, but also like dialogue, additional sounds added in post to make things more impactful, and sounds that the audience can hear, and sounds that the people in the film world can actually hear. And then there's performance, which is what the actors are doing. Yeah. So, firstly, film 1. Shaun of the Dead is a 2004 satirical zomcom starring Simon Pegg as the eponymous Shaun and Nick Frost as Ed. The film is great, possibly like it's well up there for like my favourite comedies of all time. And the combination of Wright's direction and the cast comedic talents are put to excellent work in this film. From the initial shot of the film, a medium close-up, which is about where like the frame cuts just underneath the shoulders. Pegg's performance carries across a gormless look to the audience before the camera starts to track backwards, showing off his costume, part of the mise en scene, showing a rough white shirt, the top button undone, tie loosened. He starts to sip from his pint with a cig in the same hand, and this image just tells us all we need to know about Shaun. It encapsulates his character. He's a working class white man who seems to be stuck in some kind of rut but still trying to live a normal enough life, as told of us by the location of this prologue scene, the Winchester. It's still a public place, he's still socialising, but he's distant, which is communicated by the use of using a shallow focus, which means that everything in the foreground of the frame is in focus, but the background looks distant, hazy, and blurred. This is then immediately followed up by the introduction to Liz, Shaun's current girlfriend, and the person that introduces the central conflict to the film. That conflict being that Shaun needs to escape his rut and win her back over, which helps to ground the more fantastical parts of this film, the parts that include the zombies. Because despite the fantastical elements of the film's plot, it's actually quite a grounded film due to the characters being easily relatable caricatures of British stereotypes. Shaun, the reluctant worker constantly wanting to relive his glory days. Ed, the layabout employed drunk/stoner. Liz, the only really sort of driven member of the group, not wanting to get caught in Shaun's rut. David, the overly sarcastic, repressed posh twat. And Diane, the failed actress turned drama teacher. The relationships between the characters allow for Wright and Pegg's fast and witty dialogue to shine through, with infinitely quotable lines, which most frequently happen during the moments of tension, allowing it to be partially resolved, but not in the typical gory zombie film way of breaking the tension. Except for when David gets ripped apart, because fuck David, he's such a dickhead, I hate him. He's just such a smarmy guy, just like, he's all in Shaun's face, but like, he's too cowardly to actually like back up what he's saying. As soon as he's challenged, he just wanders away and just doesn't want to deal with the consequences of his actions. The key aesthetic choice of the film is to set it in a slightly run-down area of London. This helps to add to the feeling of desolation and isolation that develops as the film goes on, with Yvonne and her group being the only other normal people alive. The protagonists meet once we enter the second act, which is when the zombies are actually like out and about and killing people. This look is only enhanced in a mirror shot from earlier in the film, so like two sequences of the film which look almost identical, but shot in the exact same way. Simon Pegg giving the same performance due to his hangover. But in the second time this shot is performed, but the sequences in, there are zombies, and he just wanders through, there's destroyed cars, zombies wandering the streets, people running, bloody handprints on walls, all that goodness, and he still just keeps wandering through, just acting like nothing else is like going on. The visual imagery presented in this film heavily conformed to two distinct styles: a classic zombie movie aesthetic with clever use of horror style cinema camera work, which I would call like long holding shots, slowly tracking or zooming into the subject. A tracking shot is a shot which moves forwards or backwards, like taking the camera closer and closer and closer in to like the subject. These long holds slow the pace, making the audience more aware of the low humming of the score, with a heavy use of 80s style synthesizer, calling back a feeling of nostalgia to like classic horror. The other style is actually very reminiscent to me of British social realism. The mise-en-scene, despite catering to the zombie trimmings, remains very much simple and creates a clear visual symmetry to before the infection. This is like further encapsulated with the costumes, which are very simple and allow for easily identifying the characters, but it still feels like these characters could actually exist in our world. All in all, I feel like this is Edgar Wright's love letter to classic zombie cinema, like George Romero's Dawn of the Dead series, but with his signature flair and a strange yet heavily fitting pacing, with moments of intense and sudden action juxtaposing quite long tension filled, yet still with comedic scenes. The comedy is heavily due to the charisma of the main cast, with Pegg's struggling underdog fitting neatly against the human antagonist David with his smarmy, sarcastic poshness, just making out to be the biggest dickhead around. He never really challenges Shaun, but always feels cowardly and gets in between Shaun and Liz many times. Right. Any questions on, like, this first bit? Did I go too much with some stuff? Right. I'm gonna continue on then, if that's cool. Right. Second film, Hot Fuzz. Hot Fuzz is the second film in what is known as the Cornetto trilogy, which is Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End. This film tackles the buddy cop genre. Our two central buddies are Sergeant Nicholas Angel and Constable Danny Butterman, as they uncover a grand conspiracy in the small village of Sanford. Angel is a cop from London with too good a record, and as the opening montage of the film reveals, he is essentially our archetypical badass with tons of experience and a group of select skills. In this film, he tends to act deadpan, acting as the straight man in most jokes, tending to take everything too seriously, which significantly contrasts the completely over-the-top final act. Danny, on the other hand, is a slightly bumbling idiot who has watched too many buddy cops, which are paid to homage to in the film, namely Point Break and Bad Boys 2. Over the course of the film, Danny learns more and more about what it means to be a policeman officer, becoming a more confident character over the course of the film. The aesthetic of this film is seemingly a lot more grounded than Shaun of the Dead, with the more fantastical elements of the film being the constantly ramping insanity of the violence, beginning with a beheading, followed by an explosion, then a head being crushed by a falling piece of church roof, then tripping and falling on a set of shears. Actually no, Leslie Tiller was fucking murdered, and an ending in a massive gun battle in a village, while the Village of the Year judges just wander around the town amongst the chaos. Despite mostly taking from the buddy cop genre, I would also argue that inspiration is taken from both the noir and the western genres. Firstly, I feel like noir can be seen in the use of light and dark in the film with chiaroscuro, which is where part of the face is covered in shadow, very commonly used in like old 40s noir films, like where you'd have the bad guy just sat there half covered in shadow. But this technique is used on characters like Frank Skinner, casting shadows over his face, making him look more mysterious and untrustworthy, which is furthered in the dialogue with him saying things like, "I'm a slasher and I must be stopped," or, "If we bashed in that head of yours, I'm sure all kinds of secrets would come falling out." I would also argue that the idea of uncovering a conspiracy is also a large part of noir films, to try to get to the bottom of this strange set of murders. But this also allows for what I would consider the grandest joke of the film. We follow Angel and Butterman uncovering what we think is this grand conspiracy about land rights and making money, but it just turns out that everyone was murdered for a completely superficial reason. Bad acting, an annoying laugh, a garish house not keeping with the village's rustic aesthetic, spelling mistakes in a newspaper, and not wanting to share their gardener's best secrets around the other villagers. The main element of Western I see in this film is Angel himself. Throughout the film, we see Angel as a man restrained by the system he works in, hampered at every turn by his boss. His claims seem outrageous to his co-workers, but at the end of the film, after the reveal that the silly bastard Frank controls the weird secret society version of the Neighborhood Watch Alliance, he finally has free reign, and he tools up, looking like a vision of the action movie gods. Aviator shades, bulletproof vest, 2 shotguns stuck out his back, rifle in hand, several pistols positioned on his body. Riding a horse as quiet Western-style music plays. Every line delivered with a calm confidence that give every insult or cool line a bite that is only seen in the classic Western gunslinging sheriff or cowboy. Then the whole concept of like the village shootout seems iconic as part of like Western heritage. It's like the classic, everyone's shooting at each other, everyone's trying to take out one guy, like in spoilers for The Mandalorian, but like in The Mandalorian when Mando and something wander through and they're trying to get to Baby Yoda, and all these goons around them are shooting at them, and it's this really tense moment of, oh my god, are they going to make it? But then, because it's a buddy cop, you know they will, because it's one of the most escapist genres. The good guys always win. It's always filled with explosions and cathartic action. yeah, that's Hot Fuzz. I think it is quite a cool phrase. Right. Any questions before I move on to Scott Pilgrim? Alright, so Scott Pilgrim is the adaptation of the comic book slash graphic novel of the same name, and thus draws a lot of its style from it. It centers around Scott Pilgrim, a 23-year-old Toronto-born band member, as he navigates a relationship with Ramona Flowers and fights her 7 evil exes. The central aesthetic to this film is that of classic arcade games, utilising quite a pixel art style immediately obvious from the Universal logo turned 8-bit, alongside a chiptune remix of the classic Universal theme. This video game style is also evident through the way Scott gains points and coins from defeating enemies, alongside the fighting game style that joins every fight, complete with announcer and fighting game and Street Fighter-like moves that Scott uses in his fight. The biggest difference between this and the other films I have already looked at from Edgar Wright is this film's use of surrealism, and to a certain extent it has influences of German Expressionism. German Expressionism was a film movement in the early 20s that had its start in painting, usually showing a world distorted by the character's perceptions and psyche. Expressionism emerged under the UFA, the German government created and funded film production company. The key features of an expressionist film are the representation of madness and desire, expressive framing of performance, and a feeling of powerlessness. All things I definitely feel like Scott Pilgrim uses. Yeah. Firstly, the representation of madness and desire is evident in the use of visual effects, tending to focus towards the idea of desire though. The world distorts constantly with dreamlike imagery, typically around Scott's desire to be with Ramona or with knives. The ideal scene, like I would use to talk about this, would be Scott wandering around the vast, barren, like dried up wasteland. A haze fills the camera, dust is kicked up, and the yet unnamed Ramona glides into frame, and just from this, Scott is infatuated her. Smash cut straight back to the real world with Scott waking up, but this isn't the only time Scott's desires are revealed like this. There are countless scenes of Scott alone, isolated in the snow, creating a contrast between the pitch black sky and the background, with Scott's centre frame. The world reflecting how he sees it, empty. Ramona has just left him, and he's alone. His band gone, knives gone. Ramona's with Gideon now. His world has fallen apart, and now he goes to claim it back. With regards to expressive performances, this is seen for almost every character. They all act so over the top, like caricatures of real people. But this only helps to build the feeling of surrealism. Not everything as it seems. These people aren't real, but you get past that, and despite how over the top they are, their core struggles are so personal and identifiable, you can't help but want them to succeed. You have the band, and all they want is to sign a contract and win the battle of the band so that they can finally get signed to a label. But it's surprisingly sad, as they seem to betray Scott and side with Gideon when they sign his contract, but you can understand their motivation behind it. All Scott wants is to prove himself and get the girl, but he can't do that until he realizes that he's a giant dick to people without realizing it. And so, when he stops fighting for Ramona and fights for himself to prove to himself that he is good enough, he earns the power of self-respect, which is a badass purple flaming katana, and is actually able to apologize to everything and everyone he has hurt along the way, and manages to succeed getting Ramona. With expressive framing, this fills every fight or music scene. VFX is used to enhance these. Jagged lines appear on screen whenever the band plays, keeping in time with the music, adding more emphasis on the crashing drums and the guitars. But this is then built up in the amp versus amp battle, where these lines of energy helped create my favourite fight scene in the film. The dragons representing the twins versus the blue electric yeti representing the Canadian sex bombs. Because did you know Canada is cold and snowy? Because it is, and they have yetis apparently now. The music drives this scene. The action only happens when the music's played. It draws you in as each member of the band falters until it's only Scott versus the two evil exes. In the other fight scenes though, this expressive framing is still seen. Strange canted angles, which is where like the subject seems to be sort of stood at an angle, or what's in the frame is at an angle because the camera's held sort of like at a 45-degree angle. Strange canted angles as Scott and the people he fights get ready to charge into each other. The background's becoming a colour-filled blur of light. Honestly, these fight scenes remind me of something like out of an anime or JRPG, which makes sense since this film seems to be a love letter to all things nostalgic and nerdy. All in all, with Scott Pilgrim, I think it's taken its place as like my favourite Edgar Wright film, just because of how different it is to everything else he's made. It's not grounded in reality, it lets itself be silly, all his films are passionate, but this feels like a different level of passion. Like, you get attached to the characters, you allow yourself to just find the fun in laughing at these little jokes which are clearly born out of the comic book. Like, all the little cutaway jokes and such. It just feels complete. Edgar Wright's great. And I guess that's the Stumpinar over. Thank you for listening to me for like half an hour bullshit on about shit.